Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar entitled Global Talent Mobility in Times of Crisis. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge these uncertain times and the difficulties and demands that we're facing, particularly for those in the global talent mobility space. With all that's on your plates, we appreciate you taking a moment out of your day to join us for this really important topic. I'd like to remind you that we're looking forward to the interactive Q&A portion of this webinar, so please feel free to drop any questions you have into the chat and I'll get them queued up. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to our presenter, Nina Brenneman.
Thank you, Heather. So hi, everyone. Just to introduce myself, my name is Nina Brenneman, and I am your host today. As you can see, I'm a solutions consultant here at Topia, but actually I have a number of years experience within the mobility industry, working in-house and also working as a consultant, working with a number of clients to help understand the challenges they face and how global talent mobility technology can help address their company objectives. So today we're going to be looking at the role of mobility in crisis, and we're going to be diving into some of the specific key challenges that come up in a crisis situation. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can go about assessing your program's crisis preparedness. So what do you need to think about as you are facing a crisis? And then things that you might want to consider to help increase your response effectiveness. So within a crisis, time is of the essence. So we're going to look at a few things that you can consider to become more effective in that manner. And then finally, we're going to explore how you can set your company up for post-crisis success. So identifying what that means and how you can help shape that. But first off, just wanted to set the scene a little bit, thinking about the role of mobility today, because I think the reality is that mobility teams today, in their normal day-to-day, actually have an increasingly complex world. So there are a lot of changes and challenges that happen on a regular basis. So changes to tax and immigration legislation, the joy of Brexit, dealing with posted workers directive and everything that comes with that, and business travelers, which are all challenges that have sort of been making the rounds for the last couple of years. So I think the reality is that there are a lot of challenges when you work in mobility, and changes continuously come up that have an impact on cost, planning, and so on. So looking specifically of the role of mobility within a crisis situation, let's first think about what is a crisis. So a crisis is defined as a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger, or a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. So actually, when you could argue that this applies to a lot of day-to-day mobility actions. So how does the role of mobility change specifically within a crisis situation? So there's a need to react quickly. It's typically something that impacts the safety of your employees. And you, as an employer, of course, have a duty of care towards them. So what we see is that mobility teams by default end up being the masterminds of all the different strands that come together to support employees and your business throughout a crisis. So whether it's dealing with international healthcare challenges, modeling out different costs of various scenarios for your business to understand the cost impact, or dealing with all the immigration implications that come up during a crisis situation. And when you think about it, there've actually been a number of different crisis challenges over the last decade. So anything from natural disasters, we've seen terror incidences, and things like we're seeing right now with the novel coronavirus. So to get a little bit of a better idea of the impact of our current crisis in your organizations, we wanted to do a little quick poll here. So how would you describe the impact of the novel coronavirus on your corporation? Would you say it's been minimal, you're operating at fairly normal levels, or with a few localized disruptions? Moderate, so you're experiencing some moderate general disruption in business, but have a few localized severe disruptions in particular countries that are heavily impacted by coronavirus. or severe, so you've seen widespread severe disruption of sales, potentially supply chain and talent force. So please go ahead and vote. And then we'll just give it a minute or two. And then Heather, when we have the answers in, if you could please bring them up.
Sure, let's give it another 10 seconds or so. Got about half
Perfect.
the participants have responded.
And I'll be curious to see sort of what the actual impact is. I think we've seen different responses from our client base today in terms of the level of disruption. I think everyone's seeing some disruption, but depending on the type of business you're in, obviously has an impact. And depending on your global footprint, there might be bigger or smaller impacts as you would expect.
And here are your results.
Thank you. So this is pretty much what I was expecting, to be honest. So it's a fairly even split between moderate and severe, as you can see. So we've got 53% saying moderate and 44% saying severe, and very few people with minimal impact. The ones who fall in the minimal impact, I am very happy on your behalf. That must be a wonderful situation to in, but I expect that most people are on this webinar today because they fall in the other two buckets. So what we've seen with this pandemic is really an affirmation of the need to have some great technology to underpin and support your program. So something to help manage and support global employees and make sure that you can ensure their health and safety. So you want to use data to understand the risk you have. And I think what we've increasingly seen from our customer base is just how crucial it is to have good, solid, easily accessible data in a situation like this, because you're looking to do basic things like being able to locate your employees, understand where the biggest impact is, like you see here. This is an example that we built for one of our customers where we identified their mobile population and then the impact of countries with coronavirus to see how this is affecting their organization. And thinking about it sort of on a longer term view as well, giving you data to be able to access the impact of that the event will have on your organization, not just immediately, but also longer term. So thinking specifically about a crisis situation, what are the key challenges that you're facing? So the main difference is typically time. So there can be a significant impact on employee health and safety. You, of course, as an employer, have a duty of care and need to decide what that looks like for you. Potential impacts, as you would expect, to tax, immigration, and other compliance. And typically there is that time-sensitive pressure, and you're having to make really key decisions that have significant business impact, but quite typically with little or incomplete data. So what we're seeing is that every different crises have a particular set of their own particular set of challenges. So taking the current situation, what we're seeing is a lot of businesses are returning assignees early, and you might be getting pushback from businesses about where those costs should fall. Looking at potential additional housing costs associated with employees having to quarantine, and then identifying who should carry that cost burden. Is it the employee? Is it the business? And often there's no sort of one size fits all. It can very much be a case of looking at it on an individual case basis. There are, of course, challenges with having to work flexibly. I'm sure many people are juggling not just working from home, but working from home with children as well. So trying to take these urgent actions with little data at the same time as juggling on a personal level can be incredibly stressful. And then thinking from a compliance perspective, having the ability to track all these displaced workers. So some organizations are choosing to continue assignments, so they're not ending assignments, but they're allowing employees to return to a home location on an indefinite basis. And then, of course, the final piece, which I think is quite typical, is that we're seeing I'm hearing a lot of people talking about assignees turning up in unexpected places. I think it's something that happens more often than people would like to think. And in a crisis situation, that's really crucial. So how do you go about assessing your program's crisis preparedness? And by this, I don't mean finding out what works and what doesn't work as you're going through a crisis. I mean proactively going out and identifying how well you're set up to be able to react quickly in any given crisis situation. So first of all, you need to think about your strategy. Do you even have a crisis strategy? Do you own it? Are you a part of it? Is it owned by someone else? What does it look like? What does it cover? So understanding what's already in place. From a data perspective, data is key. Being able to locate your people quickly, have the information you need to take decisive action is really crucial when you're under time pressure. So what is the quality and availability of the data that you need to be able to react quickly? Is it spread across multiple spreadsheets on different continents? Do you have one single system where you can quickly pull a report of all your assignees, or is it somewhere in between? And of course, processes. Do you have processes around crisis? What do they look like? Are they documented? Are they publicized? So do people know they exist? It's great having a strategy and having processes, but if they're not readily available, regularly reviewed, and easily accessible, they're not much use to you. So just to get an idea of what impact you've had in defining your corporation's response to novel coronavirus, we wanted to run a second poll here. So how would you describe your global mobility team's role in managing your corporation's response to the novel coronavirus? So were you heavily engaged? So you played a critical member of the team to formulate your corporation's response to the virus? Were you influential? So not a full member of the exec team formulating the response, but you were consulted frequently and decisions were influenced by your input. Were you consulted? So occasionally asked for input on the specific response, but didn't have a significant impact on the overall strategy. Or were you kept informed? So not specifically consulted, but informed of the response along with all other parts of the business. So Heather, let us know when we've got some responses in, and then we can look at what the output is.
Okay, we've got about a little over half the audience so far. Let's give it another few seconds so people can register their answers.
Sounds wonderful. And I'd be curious to see where this lands. I think it's obviously quite an unusual situation we're in with the fact that the crisis really spans the entire globe. I think typically a lot of crises we see will be localized to a country or a continent, but this is really global. So I would be very intrigued to see how corporations are engaging with mobility teams to get their input into the strategy, because I think it is really crucial that mobility has a voice in this kind of strategy, because there are so many strands that are affected.
All right, I'm going to share the results.
Thank you. All right, so it's actually a fairly even split, I would say. So it sort of falls heavily in the middle, as you can see, and the majority were influential. So actually played a significant part, which I'm very happy to see. I think that really speaks to how prepared your organizations are to deal with these scenarios. And then the second majority falling into the consulted bucket. So actually you are sort of not the ultimate decision makers, but certainly play an instrumental part in the strategy and the response. So thinking about your response effectiveness, what are the things that you need to think about? So what questions do you need to be able to answer? So the immediate questions are typical ones like, how many people do we have on the ground? Do we know what their family situation is? Do we know that we can account for their family? If business travelers falls into your remit, understanding how many business travelers are in the particular affected area. And then also looking at what support do you have in place? So what vendors, what agreements do you have in place that you can potentially leverage to start formulating a response to this crisis? So these are sort of the very key urgent things that typically need to be addressed as soon as a crisis starts evolving. Then sort of near term, or the next step, is starting to think about the bigger impact. So Is there going to be any impact from an immigration and tax perspective, immediate and longer term? What are we going to do about these? How are we going to address them? Are we going to acknowledge that we're going to need to pay for extra immigration cost, or we're going to pick up an extra tax bill? Is there going to be sort of a line in the sand in terms of how far you're willing to go? So identifying what you want to do in these particular situations and trying to put some guardrails in. Looking at what plans do you have in the works for those particular regions. So if it is a crisis that affects a particular region as opposed to the entire globe, looking at what is the talent plan there. Do you have specific people moving in and out who are now prohibited from moving because of the crises? And does that leave you with talent or skills shortages in that region? And what can you do to plug those gaps? So understanding not just from a mobile perspective, but also understanding how talent plays into that bigger picture. And then, of course, taking that the next step up to the wider business impact. So beyond talent, looking at cost, time, and if you're a project-based organization, is there going to be an impact to potential project completion dates? So if you have key talent that's supposed to move into a region to kick off a project, they're now prohibited because of a certain crisis, then what can you do to mitigate that? And then overall, how do you go about minimizing the business impact? So what can you do? How can mobility play into that part of thinking about alternative solutions? So again, trying to be proactive rather than reactive. And then longer term, thinking about what is our crisis exit strategy? So how do we move beyond the crisis? So sometimes a crisis comes and goes. Sometimes it's like we have today, where there isn't really a clear sort of end date in sight right now. It's very much a sort of a country by country, case by case. So think about how you're going to go about defining your exit strategy. What does that look like? How are you going to cope longer term? And also understanding what are the effects of this crisis on your business and what can you potentially do to mitigate that. So is it, I think current situation, we don't really have a lot of choice. Everyone's working remotely. So is it potentially looking at what skills do people have as countries start to open up? Are there certain people in alternative countries that you can start thinking about moving to sort of plug the skills gaps that you're seeing because of the crises? And then looking at from a cost perspective, this is one that always comes up with the business. Cost is obviously very critical and very key. So understanding what is the true total cost of the event. So there are the immediate costs that you're thinking of, which will be additional immigration charges, tax bills, potentially costs for delayed household goods shipment, storage, and so on. So that's the initial part, but longer term, over the course of someone's assignment, are there going to be other knock-on effects that you need to try and model out and take into account, and then help the business understand what is the full impact to your global mobile talent population and program of this event? So once you've sort of assessed your crisis preparedness, then start thinking about what you can do to increase your response effectiveness. So how can you act quicker? So first of all, know your strategy. So this is really critical. It's great that you have a strategy, but it's not enough to have a strategy and processes. You, your teams, your vendors, and the wider business, they need to know them end to end, inside and out. So it's key to run regular updates, make sure that new joiners are brought up to speed. If you think about it, nothing's going to slow down a crisis response like having to learn a new process as you're doing it. So it's really key that you not only define your strategy, outline your processes and operating procedures, but that everyone is intensely familiar with it, because that's what's going to make the true difference when you go into a crisis. And then understanding your key players. So who can help you out as you're dealing with a crisis? And this is really where your vendors are going to come into play. So understanding what are their full range of capabilities, what are their crises plans, how can they best support you with different types of scenarios? And you might need to run through a couple of different scenarios. So you might look at What are the options if you're looking at a natural disaster as opposed to a terrorist situation, as opposed to global pandemic? There are going to be different nuances with each crisis, but understanding what skills and what capabilities do your vendors have so they can really partner with you to make sure that they're acting as effectively as possible in a crisis situation as well. And then, of course, technology. I think it kind of goes without saying that if you're having to work across multiple spreadsheets and emails and systems to try and gather data to make an informed decision or give someone an urgent response, that's not going to cut the mustard if you're in a crisis. You're really looking at wanting to have that one single source of truth. So you have faster access to data. That means you can act faster, you can make better decisions, and you can really assess the true impact of a crisis situation. So if everyone's working off the same set of data, feeding into one single place, that way you know you've got reliable information and you can make those informed business decisions as you need to real time. And then moving on to the next step, so thinking about post-crisis success. So what do you need to do? So first of all, define your success criteria. That might sound really basic, but you need to understand, what does success look like within your organization? So what would make your business say that Global Talent Mobility handled this situation in a proactive manner and really went above and beyond with their support? So beyond the obvious of ensuring your employees' health and safety, what would be considered a success within your organization? Is it an ability to keep costs contained? Is it proactive solutions to help reduce potential compliance exposure? Is it a mix of all of it? But know the things that matter. And this is really, you're in the ultimate firefighting situation. So being able to assess the situation quickly and make informed decisions in line with what is defined as success within your organization is key. And then learn from past events. Do a debrief. Assess the strengths and weaknesses of your crisis preparedness plans after the crisis has passed. And this is really, really key. If you've been through similar situations before, is there anything that could have been easily replicated or leveraged? Looking at the current situation, what we've actually seen is companies that have long-standing operations in APAC really understood the seriousness of this disease quicker. They having experienced prior smaller scale outbreaks such as SARS and H1N1, and they were quicker and earlier to slow down relocations globally, at the same time managing expectations within the business. And I know that it can be really hard to find time to do a proper postmortem, but it's really the best way to prepare for any future incidences. Understand what worked well, what didn't, where did you get hung up, what processes weren't properly defined, what was missing from your plan that you had to create on the fly, what can you now go about improving, and so on. Look at your data, think about, what did you collect, how did you collect it, were there any pitfalls in how you were looking at your data? So making sure that you can really shore everything up to be ready for when the next crisis hits. And look at your crisis exit plan. Did it work? How did you move from your crisis and back to business as usual? Were there any things that didn't work well? Any things that you weren't expecting that came up? So taking all of this and formulating it into a full debrief and being able to review your entire crisis preparedness plan in retrospect as well. And like I said, make sure that you review that plan on a regular basis, whether it's quarterly, annually, or whatever works for your organization. But make sure that you have a designated ownership structure and clear handoffs across the entire plan. And then finally, understanding the value of talent mobility technology in a crisis. So having the capabilities to act efficiently. So if you're minimizing data duplication, effort, and streamlining those processes end-to-end through technology, you're not having to chase down people for updates on services, on cost, on people's locations. You can access it all in one single place, and making sure you've got that complete and accurate data across all systems and vendors. So again, you're going to one place to access information as opposed to working across different sources that might have information that conflicts. and then overlaying that landscape with the wider HR data landscape around talent and performance. So not only being able to look at the impact to talent in this situation, but also understanding, are there other people with similar skills or talent in other locations that you can swap around, plug in, to make sure that you're not having those gaps in projects or business continuity, and really being able to come up with proactive solutions in conjunction with your business. And then finally, leveraging your reporting and analytics to drive those greater insights. So in the situation, looking at the key information you need, so where are my people, but also looking retrospectively afterwards at what did I learn, and then ultimately using that data to explore what should I do the next time. So include it as part of your debrief to understand, what does the data tell you in terms of how you can do better the next time. And I think the post-crisis world, it's going to be different in many ways, but what we see is that businesses will once again look to global economies for hiring key skill sets, provide international experience to retain top talent, and move people around the world to take advantage of business opportunities and to really gain that competitive advantage. So I think it's here to stay. The post-crisis world is going to change things, but it's not going to stop mobility. So it's just a question of understanding how you best can prepare to be proactive in a crisis. So with that, Heather, have we had any questions come in?
Yeah, we sure have. So let's start with this first one. So are you seeing any organizations testing or running practice scenarios as a mean to assess their crisis preparedness plan?
That's a great question, actually. And I think I'd love to say that I'm seeing it now. I think the reality is that everyone's pretty much all hands on deck with the current crises right now. I've certainly seen in the past organizations assess their crisis strategy. I haven't seen as many people run scenarios as I would expect, but I would assume that after the current situation levels off a bit, that you're going to see a lot of organizations getting into that. So starting to think about, how can we better prepare for the next time? Because I think, unfortunately, there is always going to be a next time. Hopefully it won't be as globally impacting as our current situation, but I think crises occur. It's kind of the nature of the beast of what we do. And it's being able to respond effectively and proactively. And I would say, from a best practice perspective, that includes running test scenarios in advance. So I think it's certainly something we're going to see an uptick in, I wouldn't say in the next month or so, but once the current crisis starts leveling off.
Okay, great. So we have another one. What are the 2 or 3 biggest challenges you're hearing about in the industry related to coronavirus?
That's great as well. I think the biggest challenges are obviously the general uncertainty that you're seeing. So it's a lot to juggle. There are continuously changing dates, timelines, et cetera, on when countries are opening up, what they're doing, and so on. And that obviously has a wider impact on immigration and tax and so on. And I think the second one is really data. So being able to get access to what's going on with my people, how can I best prepare for a world post-crisis? What do we need to think about in terms of moving people once we can start moving people again? And are there any things that we can do now to look at getting ourselves up and running as quickly as possible once the crisis starts abating? So I think it's really dealing with uncertainty and just understanding and having access to good data and being able to use that data to prepare for a post-crisis world.
Okay, it sounds like you kind of answered the last question I have here, which is, what are you seeing across the industry in terms of HR organizations preparing for life post-coronavirus? So is there anything else that we missed in your previous answer?
I think the other thing is just sort of getting a little bit better grip of where they want to put their guardrails. I think the current crisis is obviously a little bit of a one of a kind in that it's so global, but it's So you are having to, most people I talk to are having to really deal with each case on a case-by-case basis. But I think there are certainly general guardrails that you can put in place from a policy perspective. And I'm seeing people starting to explore that. So not saying that you're going to transfer all costs to employees, but if it's a situation where the employee potentially has a choice between remaining in place or returning home, they might say, okay, actually, if you choose this particular scenario, there are going to be implications A, B, and C. And under these circumstances, we're willing to cover this particular set of benefits versus if you remain in current location, there are going to be other impacts and the business will cover certain things, but because it's a personal choice that you've taken, we may not cover other things. So it's a little bit of a give and take, but sort of putting some very, very wide guardrails on to start trying to contain some of the many sort of exceptions that are really coming up as part of this.
Well, great. Thanks so much for the time today, Nina. Let's go ahead and flip to the next. Yeah. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We've shown you here on the slide a few additional resources. You can go to our website, the link is here, to assess your organization's global talent mobility readiness, or download a recent IDC white paper on the importance of global talent mobility. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. Any questions we weren't able to answer during the session, we'll respond to via email. And Nina, thank you so much for your time and for all the great information today.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.